Welcome to episode 15 of the Challenging Approach series. In this episode, we're exploring the Greek Kai-Tak, that is, the island of Samos. The high terrain surrounding the airport makes this approach particularly challenging, with a very short final with an astounding 235-degree descending turn in close proximity to high terrain. Join me as we navigate this tricky approach. Without further ado, let's jump into the cockpit. Hello everyone and welcome aboard the flight deck of this Airbus A320 as we make the approach into Samos today. So as we're making the approach, I'm going to start by giving a briefing into the approach into runway 09. Unfortunately, the publicly available paperwork for this approach is, let's just say, pretty terrible. But what we do know is that there's two parts of this approach. So there's an instrument portion and a visual portion. The instrument portion is relatively simple, so we'll be tracking the Samos VOR on a track of 358, which can be handled within the autopilot and lateral navigation of this aircraft. Once we hit 4DME, we'll start the visual portion of the approach. So we'll descend down to 1900 feet, and that's when we'll look at disengaging the autopilot and continuing the approach visually. So once we hit that 4DME, we'll change to a track of 325 degrees towards a harbour, and we'll be looking to cross that town and harbour at about 1100 feet and fully configured for landing. As we continue along the 325 track, we'll get close to a spur on the hillside to our left, and once we pass the 240 degree radial on the Samos VOR, we'll start a standard rate turn onto final. The total turn is about 235 degrees, which is what makes it oftenly called as the Greek version of Kai-Tak. However, this turn is actually quite a bit more than the turn that's required for Kai-Tak, and so potentially more challenging as well. As we make that turn, we'll see a white building that runs over the extended centerline of runway 09er, and we'll be looking at aiming to be about 400 feet as we cross that building, that should hopefully get us on profile for landing. If I zoom out here, you can actually see that I've programmed in a couple of things in the CDU. First of all, the 4DME ring I've applied to the fix on the Samos VOR. I've also applied the extended centerline just to assist with the final turn, as well as a radial on the 240 degree from the VOR, which is an indication of when I should be starting that turn onto final. So in terms of landing itself, we can see from the landing performance calculations with the current configuration for this aircraft that the margins are relatively low, and so we really need to make sure we hit the touchdown zone, otherwise we'll need to execute an immediate go around. As we're getting a little bit closer, I'm actually going to go ahead and slow down the aircraft so we can start getting configured for the approach. So we're going to look at descending down to an altitude of 1900 initially for when we cross that town. There's 220 knots, so I'm going to go speed checked and bring out first nostril flaps. Flaps 1 set. I'm going to go ahead and slow the aircraft down further and actually activate the approach phase. Then we can use our managed speed mode. So we're going to track towards the VOR now. I'm actually going to use the vertical speed mode to begin a descent down to 1900 feet by 4DME. As we begin that descent, I'm going to drop the gear just to get us started, bring on the turn-off lights and the nose lights, and we'll arm the speed brakes as well. I'm going to bring out flaps 2 now. Speed check flaps 2 set. getting reasonably close to our altitude now. I'm going to go ahead and disengage the autopilot and set a go around altitude of 3,000 feet.
2,000. 100 above.
Going to bring out flaps 3.
Minimum.
Continue. There's 4 DME. Let's begin that turn to 325 degrees. Heading towards that harbour off to the side there. Looking for an altitude of 1,100 feet. I'm going to also go ahead and disengage the flight director and bring out the rest of the flaps. There's 325 degrees. We roll out. Looking for 1,100 as we pass the town below. Got a little bit of wind off to our right hand side there as well. There's 1,200 feet, so we're probably a little bit higher on profile. Just going to increase that descent rate a little bit.
1,000.
There's 1,100 feet. So as we cross that radial, we want to be looking at an altitude of about 900 feet. So there's a spur across to the left-hand side there. As we pass that, we'll begin that turn. So there's 900 feet. Just about to cross. Crossing now, so we're going to begin that turn and look to descend to 400 feet, keeping an eye out for the building with the white roof. There's 600
500.
feet. There's the building, so looking for 400 feet over the building. See a slightly high.
400.
We'll start rolling out. Looks like we've got the profile now.
300.
A little bit fast. We're going to bring the speed back a little bit to our final approach speed. Looking fairly good, fairly stable.
200.
Those trees need a little bit of trimming at the end of the runway.
100.
A little bit slow, just add a bit more power.
50. 40. 30. 20. Retard.
Touchdown. Versus. There's the approach into Samos.